Welcome to the Paul Street Journal, a production of St. Paul Inside the Walls. The Paul Street Journal is a show all about Catholic economics. From discussing the economic principles laid out in Scripture to answering the economic questions that come up in our daily lives, this show will be your guide to making your own economic decisions with the heart of the Church. I'm Freddy Garcia, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian Honsberger. Welcome to episode 5 of the Paul Street Journal, season 2. We are covering a Vatican II document today, Gaudium et Spes, which means joy and hope in Latin. This is not an encyclical. It's actually a Pastoral Constitution from Vatican II. And it is a short bit, I think, that we're covering from the council itself, very short bit. It's a section of Gaudium et Spes, but it's specifically on economics. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot packed into that short bit. It's a couple paragraphs, it's one section and chapter, but there's a lot of references to documents we've already covered and talked about. But before we jump into the specific section, let's talk a little bit about Vatican II and why there's this bit in Vatican II.
Sure. So Vatican II, in one sense, is a continuation and a completion of Vatican I. So Vatican I started around 1868, ended around 1869 or 1870, and it was never completed because of a war. I think Rome was captured by the big country of Italy. That was obviously a problem. and the Vatican I never ended. So there were a couple of issues that needed to be resolved. So we know that Vatican I gives us that dogma of papal infallibility. And it articulated the role of the Pope from an authoritative perspective in the Church, but it didn't properly conclude the papal authority in relation to the bishops in the local churches. So as a result of that unanswered question, there were kind of two camps in the Catholic Church in regards to authority. There was the ultramontanist, who believed that the Pope is just in charge and the bishops are just not.
Okay.
Then there was the conciliarist, and that group believed that the authority of the Church really rested in the body of the bishops as a whole in a council. Mm-hmm. And because the relationship wasn't very well articulated by the abrupt ending of Vatican I, that was a big priority for Vatican II. And it's addressed in Vatican II in at least 2 documents, which we'll talk about.
Okay.
And then another thing that Vatican II needed to address was the big changes that happened between Vatican I and Vatican II. What we see is that modernism as a philosophy, it ends in between. And we enter into this philosophical era of postmodernism. The role of the Church in the modern era, in the eyes of many, including probably Pope John the 23rd, was underwhelming. Pope Leo did such a good job of addressing modernism and from an economics and social perspective, but the lack of influence of the Church during and after World War II is a major concern. So there's this rethinking, okay, how could and should the Church be interacting with the world, influencing the world in the postmodern era? Mm-hmm. So that's another big thing.
Yeah, so this document that we're talking about is called Gaudium et Spes, but it's specifically on the Church in that space, right? The Church in the modern world, the Church with the unchurched to the people that aren't part of the Church, right?
That's right. So there's 4 major documents in Vatican II, and then there's a whole bunch of smaller ones. So 2 of the documents focus on the inside of the Church, ad intra, and then Gaudium et Spes focuses on the role of the Church and its influence on the whole world, even non-Catholics, non-believers. That is ad extra. So the ad intra document is Lumen Gentium, ad extra, Gaudium et Spes.
Right.
So, Joe, if you don't mind bringing up the Vatican documents, we'll just take a look real quick at what it looks like. So the 4 big ones are listed here: Dei Verbum, Lumen Gentium, Sacrosanctum Concilium, and Gaudium et Spes. So a lot of people will ask, or maybe even claim, that Vatican II is a pastoral council, and as a result, we don't have to care about what it says. So that's just plain false. It's not true. So De Verbum and Lumen Gentium are dogmatic constitutions. Joe, can you click on De Verbum? This is the most important document because it talks about Scripture, which is the foundation of all theology. Notice at the top it says dogmatic constitution. So really a document entitled a dogmatic constitution from a council, it just could not be more authoritative than that.
Yeah.
So you can go back, Joe. Take a look at Lumen Gentium, dogmatic constitution. Go back, Joe. Click on Gaudium et Spes, which is today's episode. Pastoral Constitution. All right. So this has to do with not dogma, but technique and goals and priorities. And then go all the way down. In addition to Lumen Gentium, which answers that question of the role of the Pope in association with the bishops, there's also Christus Dominus, which answers that question too, the pastoral office of bishops in the church. All right? So we just see the goals and the documents that fulfill those goals in Vatican II.
Right. So, and
Thanks, Joe.
Vatican II is both pastoral and dogmatic, right? As we can see in the documents.
That's right.
And they're constitutions. You know, think about the word constitution and dogma. You know, those two things together sound very authoritative, binding. And yeah, I mean, it's good to know. And again, if you want more background, we have that short special episode with Father Paul, which we'll walk through a little more.
Yeah, it's titled Doctrine, Dogma, and Encyclicals, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. It's me. Sorry for interrupting the show. I'm sure I probably interrupted Brian talking, so it's okay. But I just want to jump in to say that if you're liking the Paul Street Journal and you want to see more content like it, please do like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications so that you're notified when we have any new releases. And also, if you have any questions or comments, please do leave them in the comment section and we'll try our very best to respond to them later on in the episodes. Also, make sure to check out the other shows that are produced by the diocese. Those shows are Beyond the Beacon with Bishop Kevin Sweeney, which you can find on Bishop Kevin Sweeney's YouTube channel, and Coffee with Kupke with Father Paul Manning and Monsignor Raymond Kupke, which you can find right here on the St. Paul Inside the Walls YouTube channel. With all that said, thank you. Let's get back to the show. So this document specifically, as we said, is a pastoral constitution, and you said that's perhaps like the technique, the strategy of the church going out to the world. You know, how is the church, or even into its own flock, as it were. This document was released last, I believe.
Yes, it's the last and the longest.
It is a monster document. It is very, very long, but again, we're doing a shorter snippet of it. And I think it's kind of worth mentioning that our podcast is on Catholic social teaching, specifically on economics. And I think we've gotten to a place in the podcast where it's worth mentioning that Catholic social teaching, or reminding the audience that Catholic social teaching is a lot more broad than just economics. There are other issues, namely political or perhaps social.
Well, can I list them?
Yeah, sure.
Because this document makes it clear that it talks about marriage, family life, culture, economics, politics, and peace, as in the not war kind of peace, right? So economics is just one of those, but it is what's talked about the most in those previous social teaching encyclicals. And of course, all of these things are connected to economics.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I think it kind of just also means that there's going to be a breadth of social teaching documents that we won't get to just because they're not as connected to economics as the one we will try to get to, ones we'll try to get to, and the ones we've gotten to. But I think even in this document, it makes that claim that you just did, that the ones right before this document were kind of specifically about economics, specifically the ones that we've already gone through, right?
Yeah. Can I mention one last thing about Gaudium et Spes from an introductory perspective?
Yeah, please.
So the first council of the Catholic Church was the Council of Jerusalem, which is mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, right? Then we get the Council of Nicaea. We get all sorts of councils in Constantinople and then Trent, and we get the Vatican councils. There's, of all the documents produced by all these councils, there's only one ever that is addressed to the whole world, including non-Catholics, and this is it.
Wow.
All right, so the audience of this is not just Catholics. It's Catholics and everybody else.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right. So let's jump in. Gaudium et Spes. So we're in second section of the document.
Yeah, part two.
Part two.
Yeah.
Part 2. Chapter 3 of that section touches on the economic question, economic life. You know, you mentioned those other elements: marriage, family life, culture, politics, peace. This section is strictly about economics. So where do we start?
Immigration.
Okay. So I think one of the perhaps newer things that came out as we read it was immigration. It's become a lot more perhaps practical and real at this stage. So the document kind of touches on how to address it, what to do. And we mentioned John the 23rd, had a little bit of him, and before him, Pope Pius the 12th mentioned immigration a fair bit. And what we see in this document is perhaps still a development on that question. And specifically, I think the document kind of says that those who are looking for work outside of their own country should essentially be supported and helped. And I think that that was clear in other documents as well. But this, like we've mentioned before, is in a landscape of a lot of imbalance, especially between different nations. So that reality of people migrating away from their country to find work in another country is kind of taken for granted by this council. And they say that those people should essentially be helped. Those people looking for work, they should not only be helped to find work, but they should be helped to have their families with them. They should be helped to find a decent living. That's pretty big, you know?
It's funny. I have my Coffee with Kupke mug, which is another podcast that we host in this studio. And Monsignor Kupke, in one of the episodes, talks about Italian immigrants coming from especially southern Italy. They come not as immigrants one time, but they'll come to the United States, make a little bit of money, go back home. Do that 4 or 5 times in their lifetime. And then on the 4th or 5th time, they finally have enough money to bring their whole family over.
Wow.
But that's kind of not the story we get in high school about Ellis Island. And
No,
right?
not at all.
So, yeah, we see here a connection between economics, immigration, and family.
Absolutely.
And culture, right? The process of bringing a whole family over is extensive, challenging. It requires a lot of planning and money and communication between two nations, even, which we'll get into.
Yeah. Yeah, a note I think I want to make before diving even deeper into the content is that toward the beginning of this section, there's kind of a problem that the document mentions, and it's that people are thinking far too economically. Like, economics is the only thing that kind of drives decision making for people. So, and I think we're trying to make the claim that economics is really intertwined to a lot of these things, like family, culture, morality. And I think the document is making clear that people are kind of separating economics from that. So, I think knowing that just helps highlight how important these claims are, that, you know, your family coming to live with you is kind of an economic thing. But people, I think, are kind of losing sight of that. So I think pointing that out helps us walk through the rest of the content in a way.
Sure.
Yeah. But that's essentially it, I think, for what was new about migration, specifically in this document.
And the family component of migration.
Yeah, bringing your family. That's, you know, I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's something not only that you don't hear in high school, but, like, you know, today. I'm from a very Hispanic town in New Jersey, and I know a lot of people that came here are looking for, or are working, and their families are still in their countries, and it's difficult, you know, to be without your family strictly because you know, you're trying to provide, most of them send money back to their families, find a different life. So it's a real thing even today. You know?
Yeah, it's hard on everybody. It's hard on the father. It's hard on the mother. It's hard on the children.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the call here is a good call, a real call, but implementation is, I think, what they're seeking. You know?
Yeah, keeping families together, making the economy work for families instead of families work for the economy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, I have a new discovery in Gaudium et Spes in regards to economics, and it has to do with private property. So We've talked a lot about private property. We've also talked about the universal destination of goods. So one thing that this document is saying, and I'll just quote it, by its very nature, private property has a social quality which is based on the law of the common destination of earthly goods. When we think about the universal destination of goods, I think most people, they're probably thinking about food. I don't know why, but in their imagination, when they think, okay, the goods and the resources of the earth need to find their way to all people, and all people have access to the fruits of the earth, what are you thinking of? You're thinking of food, and you're thinking of people who are hungry. But what this document is saying is that the land is a good that needs to be distributed. All right? So we've said this before, but just in case you're just watching this episode and none of the other ones, the church does not believe in the redistribution of wealth. And that's not what distributism is. Distributism is this idea that land is properly divided in a way that makes the most amount of people in a society owners of the land that they live on and the house that they live in. And that is the best method for reducing that gap between wealthy and poor. Owning the land that you live on. Secondarily, owning the means of your production. So Catholic social teaching is crystallizing. It's becoming more and more clear over the decades. And the primary goal of private property is the land that you live on. And then secondarily, the means of production. So the earth and the land is something that all should share in. And this is being said in the 1960s, where in some nations, the majority of land is owned by very few people. Most of it is unproductive. It's just an asset that's not being utilized fully. And then there is a whole bunch of people on the planet who are hiring out their labor. They have no land. They have no stability, locational stability. So they're just wandering, looking for income. And oftentimes they're hired out through a middleman. And it's a really sad existence. So to resolve that type of life for a family, having a home base, having locational stability, and leaving that rental lifestyle, moving into an ownership lifestyle, is a primary component of this call in the document.
I think that, and then I think that that's an echo of
it is
back to Leo. Even, you know, I think the words used in this document are extravagance existing right next to wretchedness, and that's something that Leo complained about. So I think it's each document and getting to now has been this development and this constant call to address that issue. And the universal destination of goods is, I think, getting clearer each time. I think specifically here, there's this complaint that economics and production and, I guess, progress in development has become kind of this end in itself. Like people are seeking to just amass more wealth and whatnot. And here it's reiterated, I think specifically using the universal destination of goods, that all of those things, those goods, land, economics, are meant to serve man, you know, specifically. So, and when there is, like you mentioned, man or humans who are don't have anything to eat, you know, suffering, the wretchedness, the universal destination of goods is kind of calling once again and again, echoing the previous popes to address that issue, right? I remember being a little perplexed by bold claims in previous documents where popes were saying that basically every family has the right to own land that they live on and own. And I was thinking to myself, like, that's wonderful. But, like, how do you make that happen? It seems a little pie in the sky, a little idealistic. But what the church is calling for here in Gaudium et Spes is for local. Remember, we're always operating under the principle of
Distributism and subsidiarity, those principles, right? So is this right that people have to the land something that the national government handles? Minimally, I would have to say. It's probably more of a local issue, and local municipalities will know better than the national government what lands are overpopulated, what lands are underpopulated, what land is unproductive, what land is worthless, right? And from there could be the identification of, let's say, a robber baron owning a whole bunch of land that is just amassed for the sake of, let's say, selfishness. It's rather unproductive. Now that's private property that can't be just outright confiscated, as you would see in maybe like a socialist environment, let's say. But the local government is being called in this document to identify unutilized estates, to offer a fair price, and then to provide allotments to, let's say, renters. And entire systems could be developed for this. And I've seen many in history. The government purchasing land from an estate and then just giving it away is economically not viable, right? So there could be low interest loans given to the new occupiers of that land. It could be a work to own situation. There's many opportunities there. But redistributing that land to give people a home base, to give people an ownership environment, locational stability, which is good for the family, right, is what this document is called for. And what we see here is the church's recognition of a government's ability and maybe even sometimes responsibility to utilize eminent domain, which is this idea of the government taking control of land for the sake of the common good, even if that's private property at times. But of course, that can't be the government acting as a bully, right? But as an advocate for the common good.
Right.
And oftentimes, perception is a huge part of that equation.
Right. Yeah. No, I like that you mentioned that. I think that in the document, there's this clear, the word responsibility, I think I think the document agrees with that wording, that there is this responsibility even from public authority to pursue the common good and use whatever means they have to something like eminent domain, distribute land to those who need it. And I think that there's also this idea of the responsibility falling on a lot of us. We've kind of gone through that, this solidarity, that it's not, we can't just like say that this is the government's responsibility and be okay with the problem, There's this real like harmony and that comes from solidarity in addressing this problem. But realistically, I think that there is a lot of responsibility put on the government, on public authority, local, state, and then federal at that, and maybe even like international.
Yeah. We're going to now, I think, shift our conversation to this synthesis of the two subjects that we brought up that we find to be innovations or advancements in Catholic social teaching on economics in Gaudium et Spes. So you talked about immigration. I talked about land. And now I think we're going to see how they come together because, in my opinion, the national government plays a bigger role probably in immigration, right? Because Catholic social teaching is calling for nations to have a relationship when there's an immigration event.
Right.
Now, before we get into that integration, I just wanted to ask you a rhetorical question that you don't have to answer.
Okay.
But you can answer if you want.
Listening.
This whole emphasis on land in Catholic social teaching, all of the documents that emphasize land so far, including Gaudium et Spes, pre-exists the switch to fiat currency and the ending of the connection of the US dollar to gold. So in a fiat currency environment, we get this idea of the regular devaluing of the currency and a somewhat normal and predictable rate of inflation. So does the church's teachings on land continue to apply in the current era of economics with the Federal Reserve System, fiat currency, and then, regular devaluation of the dollar?
I'm going to leave it as a rhetorical.
Well, there's more documents coming, right? So the future documents will help us discern the answer to that question. But what I'd like to argue for today is that land may be even more important in a fiat currency environment. Because right now, our attachment to the dollar in our savings accounts, in our salaries, it's connected to our trust in the value of the dollar. It's not connected to anything real. So if everybody today suddenly said, the value of the dollar to me is zero, well, then guess what the value of the dollar would be? Zero, right? If that's the case, where is your wealth? If all of your wealth is in US dollars, you have no wealth.
Yeah.
But if you own land and the US dollar goes kaput, you still have the value of your land. No matter what currency takes over, the property that you own still has real value because land is real.
Yeah.
And you got to live there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So in my personal opinion, I'm always trying to make sure that a third of my wealth is in real property, right? Like land. And I'm not saying 100% of it has to be.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm not a landlord,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right. But I do believe that land is a hedge against currency risk.
Yeah, this is a bit of a side note, but it's funny you mention this because I'm young, trying to live sparingly, you know, save to hopefully buy a home in the future. But the other day I was just thinking, I was like, if the value of the dollar just went poof, I would lose everything. The living sparingly and trying to save and the money in my bank account that I'm hoping to use for private property and to live in the future. If that happened, I was just like, you know, and it's funny that you mention it now because it's a real thing. It's kind of like, I was a little scared. I was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You know?
I'm especially concerned for people who are over-invested in currency for their retirement. You know, I feel like the same thing goes for retirement. You should have a currency diversity, right? People love having a diversified portfolio, but if it's all in dollar, it's not diverse.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. And I think some people would agree. Like it sounds intuitively sensible, you know? So yeah, no, I like the thought.
Okay. All right. So I think that Gaudium et Spes has real solutions in regards to land, and that has to do with current U.S. citizen renters, let's say, or renters in their respective countries, and then a land solution for migrants. So there are, in the United States, hundreds of dead rural towns and an unfathomable amount of unused space in the United States. I've been to probably 40 of the 50 states in my lifetime. And the one thing that I noticed as somebody from the Northeast is just the incredible amount of space.
Yeah.
It's really hard to understand unless you go there and you just look for miles and miles and there's just nothing. So what the church, I think, is calling for here is local governments to assess unused space, to offer fair prices to purchase the land or to even recruit people to come to their area to make the place productive. This, of course, means that these local environments, societies need to maintain the character of their little society. And I think a lot of people would be against spreading out. I think a lot of people who are concerned for the environment are saying, no, we shouldn't spread out. We should condense, right? Like occupy less space. But I think technology will allow for just the opposite. I think the church is calling for people to own the land and to have space and to make that land productive does not necessarily have to be against the environment. We're in a time where you could get electricity with no grid, you know, whether that's wind or solar or whatever, and you could be very environmentally friendly and have your own space. So city life isn't necessarily the solution to the environmental crisis.
Yeah. I think the popes before this document have also kind of mentioned that. You know, there was that fear before, whether it's like overpopulation or environmental concerns, They're almost like, what's the word? I don't think they were dismissive of it. They were just like, we can redirect all the effort to that problem and probably find the solution, and live by these principles that we've been talking about for centuries and probably find the solution,
Yeah, I think green technology is a part of what John the 23rd was saying about alleviating environmental concerns with technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm glad you brought that up. Here's a quote from Pope Francis. "We were not meant to be inundated by cement, asphalt, glass, and metal, and deprived of physical contact with nature." So connection with nature, it could be, I live in New York City and I'm going to go to the Catskills for a weekend, right? I don't know if that's connection to nature as much as really living on the land and becoming one with the land.
Yeah.
Over a lifetime. I think that's what he's
Some people might think he's a hippie for this, but hey, he has a point.
Yeah. So historically oppressed people in the United States tend to be in a rental situation, a landless situation, or they are living in environments where the land is not productive, it's worthless. I think about the deserts of Arizona. If you've been to a reservation of Native Americans in Arizona, I mean, these are very tough lands that they were given.
Yeah, I can imagine.
One biblical principle that is rather consistent that we have not addressed is the idea of repairing injustices that were done in the past. And following the Emancipation Proclamation, I hope you both heard of this in like high school or whatever, but 40 acres and a mule. Have you heard of this?
I've heard of that phrase.
Yeah. So the whole idea is, okay, this country oppressed your people for 400 years. We can't just liberate you and just say, oh, good luck. Right? That might be a little much to expect if you're just starting from scratch. So 40 acres was considered a fair reparation following the Emancipation Proclamation. And it happened, especially along the Atlantic coast in the Carolinas and parts of Georgia, maybe. But after a couple of years of that, and it was rather successful, it wasn't done everywhere, but it was done in that area, it was repealed. And the land was given back to the original slave owners. So that was a great thing that was undone, a missed opportunity. But just imagine, had those who were emancipated given the opportunity to own land, how that could have changed history, and how that could have prevented the urban rental environment that came to be for many African Americans in the United States. And what if something similar were to be done for Native Americans? I think that that's something that would be just, and it would fulfill Catholic social teaching here.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame that like there's at face value perhaps like tension in a lot of the principles of Catholic social teaching, because we say private property, no robbing from those who own to redistribute, right? But then there's a serious call to distribution of land, and then there's people that have so much land that we can't steal from them because that's wrong, which is true. Yeah. So there's this tension, which is difficult. But I think what's perhaps the call, and it's always the call, is that change of individual hearts. Like if we're all following these principles, if there's solidarity and love for our neighbor, there is no tension almost in these principles, right? Because it makes sense to, out of my abundance, to give, right? There's a quote actually that I'd like to read, which kind of touches on this, that like the individual change of heart is what makes this tension between these principles kind of go away. So this is specifically on our neighbor being needy and some of us having abundance, right? And the council, I think, takes it a step further than just what's in our abundance for this question of helping those in need. So I'll quote, "Faced with a world today where so many people are suffering from want, the Council asks individuals and governments to remember the saying of the fathers, feed the man dying of hunger, because if you do not feed him, you are killing him," right? And that's kind of loaded. Like, it's kind of dark.
Yeah, I'm almost sure that the first person to say something like that was John Chrysostom in the 4th century. So this is an ancient
idea,
a way of thinking about it.
Yeah. So and I think that's why it's almost a shame that, an initial response to these principles might be like, well, there's tension between those principles. But I mean, I think it's that what we've constantly reiterated, that it has to come from within. Our hearts have to change in order to live out these principles and to pursue them.
I'm with you 100%, and with the document 100% on that. Mm-hmm. I also think there's a lot less tension than is perceived. Perceptions aren't always true and accurate. Mm-hmm. Don't forget about the huge amounts of open land in the United States, and the church's allowance for eminent domain and local governments identifying underused private property, offering something fair for that, and making that more properly utilized property, and fulfilling that call of the universal destination of goods in regards to land.
Yeah, I hear you. So what is next?
Well, the last thing I want to talk about with renters in the United States moving towards ownership is the fact that there are municipalities in the United States right now offering bonuses for relocation. So this is happening all over the place, but everybody wants to be in cities. We talked about that in the last episode, where people are leaving rural areas because they're under supported. So now local rural municipalities are actually recruiting, offering signing bonuses for moving there and being there. And that could be done in a good or bad way.
Yeah.
We don't want a whole bunch of remote tech workers just kind of like hipsterizing a really conservative neighborhood or anything.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of cultural considerations to make, but it's worth noting that this is in a mild way happening right now.
Yeah. And I appreciate the point, that's maybe one tension there. You want to incentivize people to come and support this, struggling community, but you don't want
Well, we don't want a fast food like massive chain to replace like the coffee shop.
Right, exactly. For sure.
So there's definitely considerations to make.
Yeah.
I'm happy I didn't use any company names there. Okay. So the last thing to talk about is immigration and its connection to land here. So what I'm going to be talking about is reform to immigration laws in normal circumstances. So we're not talking about the migrant who's coming because he or she is oppressed, a refugee from war. Like, that's a different scenario. Right now, I'm just talking about normal circumstances. So one way to fulfill the call of providing land and the call to help immigrants in Gaudium et Spes is to encourage local municipalities and societies to identify the labor needs in their area, to identify the space that's available, and maybe report that to a larger body, even the national government. And then for other countries that have perhaps too many people or not enough land, to communicate nation to nation and to create a relationship that cares for the good of all parties. That includes the two nations, but also and especially this family that might do best by emigrating and immigrating. Now, there's all sorts of good and bad ways to do this. Right now, oftentimes we have such a polarized, unhealthy immigration situation in the United States. We're oftentimes allowing the best and the brightest of nations to come to the United States, but not the poor. And what that is often called is brain drain. So everybody coming to Harvard, they go to an Ivy League school, then they stay here and they make tons of money. And what that is taking away the wealth from certain countries, the intelligence. It's almost just like we're sucking the life out of other countries, right? So that's going on. And then there's the impoverished from other countries coming to the United States, oftentimes against the law, right? So it's such a non-relational, non-healthy situation that we have.
Yeah.
But we want to make sure that our policy that we're going to, I swear Congress is going to do this any day now. They're going to create a fair, balanced immigration plan that has a global perspective. It has a class perspective and skill perspective. Yeah, do we need a couple of doctors? Yeah, sure. But we also need agricultural workers. And we want to make sure that we're addressing every layer of society, just as John the 23rd would call for.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. What I love about this is that, you talking at this upscaled state, international, national level, it sounds like the individual level just at greater scale. Like the principles kind of remain the same, right?
Yes.
If one individual has plenty and his neighbor is wanting, then there should be a relationship there. That's the word. It's not just, I'm giving him a sandwich and then, I'm out of here. But it's this relationship. And the same thing applies the bigger the scale, right? Especially between nations. And I think it's all the same general idea that we're forming relationships out of love. And that's where the balance comes from, not from a great idea or system, or maybe that can be part of it, but like it's built upon that.
The relationship, yeah. And that's the only way that it could be mutually beneficial. The only way for safe transport even is through the relationship of the two governments. If one government is aware of what's happening and the other government isn't, or if neither government is aware, what that leads to is unsafe transportation oftentimes. So I think a generous legal route to immigrating to the United States will encourage legal immigration. So let's say that relationship between the two countries works out, there's safe transport, and then either free or very affordable land is given to a new migrant. And they automatically, from the beginning, have locational stability for their family, a place to call home, and a base to begin their life. Do you think they're going to have a better life or a worse life, absolutely. Right? So by establishing a very fair and even generous legal system, will that encourage or discourage illegal immigration?
Discourage illegal immigration.
Yeah. If the process of doing it legally is so beneficial, people are going to want to do that.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And on the flip side, a non-generous immigration system will promote illegal immigration.
Yeah, it's pretty sensible.
I think a lot of people, in regards to the immigration thing, they're going to be asking, okay, well, what about belligerent nations where there is no relationship and migrants are still wanting to come over as refugees? Well, that's a different situation.
Yeah,
right?
totally different.
We can address that another time. In fact, I think we should have a whole episode in season 3 on immigration.
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, I think that does it for this document. Again, it's relatively short, but there was a lot packed in. And we ended on a question of big scale. We're talking about immigration between nations and whatnot. So it might feel like, oh, great, how are we supposed to implement this? How are we supposed to change the law? But I think that the thing that we've constantly reiterated is the hearts over systems. So I think there's the very last sentence of this section of the document, I think, reiterates that as well. So I'd like to read it, maybe as like a nice send-off. It says, anyone who in obedience to Christ seeks first the kingdom of God will derive from it a stronger and purer love for helping all his brethren and for accompanying the task of justice under the inspiration of charity. And I love it. I think it really sums up what the principles mean to love, the way Christ loves, the kenosis, to form relationship. And then that way, we can change the world. Right? But it starts there. It starts with us as individuals in our hearts, loving our neighbor, right? But I think I'm glad we had a pastoral constitution that touched on the economic question, and if you look at the footnotes, it's strictly what we've been going through. Even the radio message from Pope Pius, all kinds of things. So I think this would be a great place to go to for reference to all the things we've been talking about. It's really well summarized, really well articulated as guidelines moving forward from this time. But like you mentioned, there's more to come. So we'll cover that in the remainder of this season. But I think that does it for today. So
next time we'll address encyclicals by Pope Paul VI.
He's right after Pope John 23rd, right? Pope John opened this council. Pope Paul VI closed it. So we're getting some back-to-back papal action. So yeah, that does it for this episode. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Joe. And thank you all for listening to the Paul Street Journal.